Hi, I am Dr. Elisa Demena, and today I'm going to give you an introduction to the endocrine system. So what does it do? Basically, it's a way of the cells in your body being able to talk to each other. And this is the slow route, right? So neuronal systems, nervous systems, all of that, that's quick. Those are mediated by different types of things, such as action potentials or electric-like conductances. However, when it comes to communicating in the endocrine system, we're using the snail mail version, right? So these are chemical messengers. And what they do is they have different levels and cycles that help work together to maintain homeostasis in the body. Also, they can help tissue undergo conversions, such as the developmental processes. Right. So when we're looking at the similarities and differences between the nervous and endocrine systems, we can start by looking at some of the chemicals that they both have in common. Basically, all of the chemicals that they're going to release and or manipulate are going to be specific for they're going to carry specific messages to what we call target cells, right? Those are the cells that they are trying to talk to. So some of these chemical messengers that they have in common are like epinephrine and norepinephrine, for example. If they're going to be released from the adrenal medulla, they're called hormones and they're slower acting. However, they can be used by neurons as neurotransmitters when they're released and communicated directly from neuron to neuron. So both of these types of chemical messengers are used and regulated using a negative biofeedback mechanism. So as much as we all love positive biofeedback, the body is pretty attuned and pretty hard set in maintaining a negative feedback cascade. So it means that it reacts more often to things that it doesn't like as opposed to things that it does like. So in short, both of these types of chemical messengers, that what they have in common, they well, and the ones that they don't have in common as well, work to coordinate, regulate activities of all the different cells, organs, tissues, in order to achieve that one main goal, that end game of maintaining homeostasis in the body. So the endocrine system is kind of big. It uses a lot of different organs. Some are specific and some are not so specific. Um, The thing is, though, there are some organs you'd never even think of as being part of the endocrine system. Organs like, say, the heart and the digestive tract. So within those particular organs are specific tissues, which we consider glandular. That means that they make chemical messengers and they secrete them. Where do they secrete them? Just basically out into the cellular fluid, where they're either picked up by the bloodstream lymphatic system or are supposed to be directly targeting the cells that are, oh, sorry, cough, choke, wheeze, that they're immediately secreting into. So if they're closer, like a local type hormone, such as a prostaglandin, that's specifically supposed to affect the cells in the nearby neighborhood, right, in the community, right? Hormones, however, hormone proper, however, are released into one tissue and are usually picked up by the bloodstream, and they're sent all over the place. Now, just because they're sent all over the body doesn't mean that they act on every cell in the body, but they do reach certain populations of cells that have receptors on the outside. They're ready to receive that signal and find out what it is that the hormone needs them to do or change. Here are some of those organs and tissues of the endocrine system. This is a really great graph. Trust me, it's going to show up in the homework and it's totally going to show up on the test. Let's take a look at what it is. So basically, it's a graphic depicting the proper organs and tissues of the endocrine system, and then it has a couple of the secondary endocrine organs listed as well as some of their functions. Okay, so firstly, let's talk about what's in the brain. Seated right at the middle, near the brainstem, is the hypothalamus pituitary gland and the pineal gland. So these regulate, these are like the top regulators of endocrine systems in the whole body. Okay, so the hypothalamus and pituitary gland work really closely together, like literally next door. So they produce things like regulatory hormones, positive biofeedback. They also produce things like hormones that are used in the feminization or masculinization of a person, also during pregnancy. They control or begin cascades with the thyroid. Also, the pineal gland specifically is one of my favorites. It controls sleep. Ah, melatonin. Anyways, let's travel down a little bit to the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. It's the butterfly-looking gland that sits right below your voice box. So go ahead, you can kind of almost feel it there. Anyway, so these thyroid glands, parathyroid glands, generally work to maintain, oh gosh, what is the word I'm thinking of? Metabolism. Oh, metabolism in the body. Right, so sorry. Which has a wide range of adjacent effects downstream. So the thing is many of your patients, especially as they age, are going to end up with what we consider to be the thyroid imbalances, right? And they'll need supplemental thyroid hormones, or they'll also need, or perhaps otherwise need, different types of medication that can maybe reduce the activity of the thyroid gland. We'll get to those in a little bit. Anyway, moving on. The adrenal glands and the pancreas. So the adrenal glands are situated right directly above the kidney. And they're important for a few things. Flight or fight response, for one, epinephrine, norepinephrine, there they are again. Some of the other ones are that are secreted have to do with controlling things like uptake or storage of energy as fat in the body, as well as perhaps working in concert to manage stress, hence the norepinephrine and epinephrine releases. Let's see, what's next? Oh, pancreas, good old pancreas. It's really a sugar one. That one's about sugar. It's situated right underneath the stomach, as you can see, at the top of the small intestine. And that's an important place to be because the release of insulin or glucagon helps the body regulate how much sugar it has circulating in the blood at any given time. Too much, not a good thing. Not enough, not a good thing either. But we'll talk about those coming up. And then lastly, we have a handful of these organs with secondary endocrine functions right here in this kind of tannish looking table. So everything from the heart, thymus, fat tissue, meaning adipose tissue, digestive tract, kidneys proper, as well as the gonads, which would be the testes in male and ovaries in female, can also secrete hormones that can cause changes in tissues throughout the body. So let's get back to hormones because we'll go and expand more on the organs of the endocrine system in a bit. So first thing you got to know is what is it that they're secreting? So they have a couple of different isoforms or way that they're composed. So one of them is considered to be based on amino acids. So they are structurally similar to amino acids and relatively small for the most part. So these are usually things like epinephrine, norepinephrine, the thyroid hormones, and of course, one of my favorite, melatonin. Peptide hormones are a little bit different, just mainly that they're a little bit bigger. So these are chains of amino acids, so they are physically a little bit larger, and this is also the broadest class of hormones. So most hormones are going to fit right into this one, and this includes some fun ones like oxytocin, hypothalamic and pancreatic hormones as well. Oh, and of course all those hardcore regulatory ones being produced and regulated by the pituitary gland. An important class to know about is what we call the steroid hormones. So these are structurally similar to cholesterol. So because they're structurally similar to cholesterol and they're lipid derivative, it means that they can pass right through the cell membranes. So cells pick these up really easily. Usually they have to be bound to some type of a transport protein in order to make it around the circulatory system without being basically absorbed by everything, all the cells in the direct proximity that it's produced in. It's oftentimes released by things like the adrenal glands and reproductive organs, the secondary types of, the reproductive organs being a secondary type of endocrine organ. And the next ones are the eicosanoids. This is actually a pretty large molecule. These are based also with fatty acids, right? So lipids, and can relatively easily diffuse through the cellular membranes. So these are going to affect large-scale enzymatic processes, and they include things like the prostaglandins. So hormones, what are they doing? Basically, they're changing what cells are doing at that particular time. So it can be activities such as metabolism, it can change their location, like have them migrate, or it can also change the quantities of the cells, but also the structural proteins and enzymes. So quantities could be things like growth hormone, right? Signaling for more and more cells to become mitotically active and thus allowing the body or perhaps just that particular region of the body to grow in size. Another thing that's important to remember about hormones is even if a cell has the ability to react to it, it needs to be presenting receptors on the surface. That's right, it needs to be able to have a way of receiving that message for that particular hormone at that time. And cells can change their amounts of receptors on the surface or on the inside of their cellular membrane depending on a whole suite of other factors, including the presence or absence of other hormones at that time. The other thing that's important is just like we were talking about how lipid based hormones can diffuse through the cell membrane or the plasma membrane a little bit easier than others, is the fact that receptors are usually located in one of two places. The first is either right on the outside surface of the plasma membrane or they're on the inside part of the cell. Here's a little bit of a schematic showing how this is supposed to operate. So endocrine cells are releasing the hormone, right? They make it inside those wonderful cuboidal little shapes of theirs and they secrete, otherwise meaning they exocytose or push out the protein products or the hormone products, which can also be lipid-based and a number of other types, out of the cell body. Usually they're picked up at some point by the circulatory system, as this one at number 2 is entering the bloodstream, this little purple hormone. And we have a couple things that can happen. The first one, we'll say little red dot number 3, means that it would bind. So in this case, we show this particular hormone binding for a receptor, right? So a receptor, again, is a little molecule that goes on the surface of a cell or can even be on the inside of a cell that fits just like hand in glove, mediating the reaction between a hormone and, of course, the cell itself. And it allows the cell to be told directions by the presence or absence of that hormone. Another option is that it could be distributed throughout the body. And if receptors are not present, it means that even though it's going to be around these cells all the time, maybe it's a different cell type, like shown here, it's not a muscle cell anymore, it's neural tissue, it just can't bind to them. So it doesn't matter how much hormone's out there. If a cell can't pick it up and read the signal, then it's just not going to make any changes. So let's talk about receptors for a minute, right? So a receptor is on the outside of a cell in most cases, and sometimes on the inside of the cell as well. Most hormones that are not lipid soluble, meaning they don't have a fatty acid component, things like epinephrine, norepinephrine, any of the peptides, eicosanoids, all of those, they are going to require things like a surface receptor or a receptor that sits on the outside of a cell. They can't diffuse through the plasma membrane. So if a cell does not have these receptors, it means it can't be turned on or off or modulated in any way by any of these hormones, even if it normally would be able to react if it had the receptor. So the receptor is required. That's important to remember. The other thing to know is that if it's going to be a hormone that uses a surface receptor or a receptor that's on the outside of the plasma membrane, that it's going to need some help getting its message across the rest of the cell. So the hormones are what we call the first messengers, and they activate later on a second messenger. The second messenger is something that sits in the cytoplasm and swims down, usually modulating some type of activity in the nucleus or signaling for the production or the cessation of production of different types of products, such as enzymes, for example. Oftentimes, you're going to see this one, a G protein, a G-coupled protein, a G-linked protein, to work and as part of this messenger system in an enzyme complex. Also, sometimes just a little bit of hormone can go a really long way. So this is a process we call amplification, right? So if you amplify something, you're going to make it bigger than the original. And so what this does is it allows the magnification of the effect of the hormone on a cell. And so what will happen is we'll still have their original primary messenger, like the hormone, right? And it swims down and it binds to a surface receptor on the outside of the cell. However, once the message has been picked up by the cell and the secondary messengers come into play, some of these being cyclic AMP or CAMP, CAMP, right? Calcium ions or CGMP, cyclic GMP. A whole bunch of different things can happen. So just a single binding event of a hormone to the cell on the receptor can actually signal for tons and tons of production of these secondary messengers. So let's talk about a secondary messenger system for a second. First, let's introduce you to this one, CAMP, or cyclic AMP, CAMP. Okay, this is a pretty important one, and mainly because it activates these big G proteins, or these G-coupled proteins. You're going to see a lot of those, especially dealing with things like medicine. Anyways, it activates an enzyme, adenylate cyclase. And adenylate cyclase has the important position, the very important job of converting regular old ATP, right, the chemical currency of the cell, into CAMP, right? The CAMP in turn activates a host or sometimes just specific suites of what we call kinase enzymes inside the cell. Once this is activated, it does this important process called phosphorylation, right? So see all those P's in CAMP and ATP? Those are phosphates. Phosphorylation is this. It's basically just sticking a phosphate group onto something else. Just tagging it with a phosphate. Just pulling one off of yourself and putting it on some other enzyme or some other molecule. And it's interesting because by phosphorylating certain types of enzymes, for example, you can either turn them on or turn them off. It's like a switch. So cyclic AMP is important for this ability to turn on and off specific types of enzymes. Here's a nice schematic of that. For example, say there's a first messenger coming through, maybe some norepinephrine, maybe some epinephrine, and it binds on the surface of the cell. See the plasma membrane right there at step 1? So the little purple hormone is going to adhere directly to the receptor, the green box. Now the thing about a receptor is it usually has these G proteins, these G-coupled proteins really close by. So they're on the inside of the cell. G proteins are on the inside of the cell. They become activated when the hormone and the receptor bind together and stick together. Next thing that happens is that G protein is going to activate adenylate cyclase, which now is going to turn that ATP into CAMP, right? We're going to phosphorylate some stuff. So CAMP in turn activates kinase enzymes. And kinase are going to do all kinds of things. Anytime you see A's, think enzymes. So kinase enzymes is kind of a double name in a way. A's means it is an enzyme. Anyway, so the kinases are going to work to alter enzyme activities. That means they can turn them on, they can turn them off, they can turn them up, they can turn them down. It just depends on what it is that first messenger is supposed to tell the cell what to do. So as a result of all this new enzyme activity after being phosphorylated, the target cell is going to change in some way. Maybe it'll change its shape. Maybe it'll secrete something. Maybe it'll start going through the stages of mitosis and start splitting, right? Okay, and so that's the inner process of how hormone acts when it needs to use a membrane-bound receptor to initiate a cascade on the inside of a cell. So receptors don't just exist on the outside of the cell. Many receptors exist on the inside of the cell as well. So they're inside the cytoplasm, right, or the goo inside of the cell, or even inside of the nucleus itself, or just along the outside of the nucleus along the nuclear membrane. So we're going to use these for what we call our lipid-soluble hormones. Most of those lipid-soluble hormones don't have to worry about being a first messenger that binds to a surface receptor. Nope, they slip right through that plasma membrane. Sloop! And they act fast. So thyroid, various steroid-type hormones, cholesterol-based, fatty acid-based stuff, that's the ones that we're talking about. So they cross the plasma membrane right away. And then they go into the inside of the cell, and it's the inside of the cell where they actually form their hormone receptor complex. And so it's going to turn on or it's going to turn off a couple of genes. it's going to result in some major changes for the cell. We know one thing for sure. Every time it happens, we're going to change how much mRNA is being transcribed, or at least what mRNA transcripts are being transcribed. Here's what it looks like. For example, say we have our steroid hormone. Right there you see all those rings. That's kind of a cholesterol-based conformation, right? So it's going to move right through that membrane lipid. It doesn't need to be transported. Nothing, just slurps right through. It moves fast. Steroids go straight into, in this case, the nuclear membrane, where it will bind to a receptor. And that binding will change how much, what particular sites or how much of a particular site of DNA is being transcribed. On the other side, we have a thyroid hormone, right? It looks like a little barbell, purple barbell. So it'll be transported across the plasma membrane, and it's got an interesting receptor position. It's actually going to bind to the receptor of a mitochondria and the nucleus, right? There you go. So it's going to a couple places. So as soon as it binds to the mitochondria, it turns up production of ATP. Crank it up, mitochondria. That's going to alter the cell response, but it's also going to provide a lot more energy for that change or that cell response to occur. So the other parts of those thyroid hormones that slip into the cell go directly into the nucleus. And when they're there, they start changing what types of proteins are going to be made, right? What type of mRNA is going to be transcribed, which alters what we call protein synthesis. It means there's going to be more of this protein or less of that protein. Generally, that protein is going to be assembled into some type of an enzyme or work as a structural protein in some way. And now that it has these proteins, especially the enzymes, have been altered, we're going to need that ATP we had originally produced. And that's how we solicit a target cell response from a thyroid hormone. As you can see, it's kind of neat that it goes into two places and it has this whole roundabout way of getting to its homeostatic endgame. Hormone secretion and distribution. Basically, as hormones are secreted, which is a relatively slow process, they enter the bloodstream, and it's that circulation throughout the body that allows it to have a relatively fast-acting impact. So some hormones are actually meant to be burned through right away. So a lot of circulating hormones that are considered short-lived are short-lived because they stop working when they, number one, get where they need to go and turn on the cells in the way they need to be turned on, or two, they're actually picked up by the waste removal system and broken down by the liver or kidneys. And then three, some of them are actually pulled off by enzymes that are already in the plasma or just sitting in the interstitial fluid of the cells that had secreted them originally. So those are some other ways that they are taken out of activity by the body. So control of endocrine activity. As we talked about before, it's about negative feedback, right? So hormonal secretion usually has to do with something not so great happening in the body that the body has somehow sensed and needs to alter, change, or react to. We consider these stimuli, this bad feeling of a stimuli, I guess, to be into three different categories: the humoral, the hormonal, and neural stimuli groups. So humoral, like humors, like the humors of the body from the olden days. Yeah, there we go. There's our name in there. It's definitely not exactly that though. Anyway, so what this does is it changes composition of things like fluids, right? So extracellular fluid, for example, but also can change things like the level of ion abundances in the blood, such as the level of calcium, for example. Hormonal stimuli changes what the circulating hormone levels are, right? So men just don't have testosterone, women don't just have estrogen. We have balances of both of these and many other types of hormones. Neural stimuli works a little differently. So neural stimuli is going to stimulate the neuroglandular junction. That means the place where a neuron touches a gland from the endocrine system. And it's going to work using neurotransmitters. And so once those neuroglandular junctions, or those glands that are connected to neurons, are stimulated, now we have either more production or reduced production of endocrine activity. So that's a basic introduction of the endocrine system. We should have some other videos up shortly here that are going to go over the organs more specifically, and even some certain pathologies if you're so interested. But if you have any immediate questions, feel free to email me. I'd love to hear from you. Bye!